I think that Bucky's legacy and significance are here to stay. You know, he certainly had his, what I would call his style. He spoke in monotone, and it was rhythmic and repetitive. It was, I mean, if I had to make an analogy, I'd say it's a Philip Glass piece of music. You know, it went on, and yet, like Philip Glass, every time you'd see a slight different intonation, slight different twist on the take of it. And of course, this was the first of many, many meetings that went on for years in different contexts and different circumstances. Sure, I was just beginning to get into the profession, and here comes this intense, balding man with this stare that grips at you and talks about everything. He talks about climate, he talks about materials, he talks about construction. He shows his projects, the Damascene Dome and the Damascene car and the Damascene house. And we got involved with making things, and there's a spirit about it. There's a kind of philosophy about it. There's a politics about it. It's really multidimensional. You can't dissociate the physical from the political, for example. Bucky was saying, you ought to build with economy, and he was saying so philosophically because if you build with economy, you preserve resources of the earth, and you also provide more to everyone as against building uneconomically, using too much material, using too much resources. And he also, in some strange way, predicted the kind of technological revolution that followed after. I think that I learned from Louis Kahn to make a connection. And I make that connection because Lou Kahn had a great deal of influence on Bucky Fuller. He was introduced to Kahn by Ann Ting, his partner and associate at one period in his life, and under the influence of Fuller, designed the ceiling of the Yale Art Gallery with its three-dimensional octahedral ceiling. And under that influence, he also went with Ann Ting to design the model of an office building, which was a three-dimensional lattice that sort of rose in the sky as a kind of braced structure. Very radical structure that is yet to be equaled, I think. And so from Kahn, I learned that architecture was about building. And from Fuller, I learned that building was about understanding and stretching materials to their limit. And so if Kahn was about building, I'd say in the kind of a way of mass, Fuller was about building, to use Kundera's term, with a lightness of being. A lightness of being. I think the fact that the whole generation of architects, Renzo Piano, Norman Foster, Richard Rogers, I'm focusing on the Europeans, but there were mostly Europeans, created an architecture of lightness and devoted their life to an architecture of lightness is really indebted to what we all got out of Bucky Fuller. He was very much into mapping. He was into mapping resources. I think he was aware of the dwindling resources of this planet before we became aware of climate warming and the impact of consuming those resources a generation or two later. I think the embracing of Bucky's ideas were very were extensive but very narrowly channeled. For example, we know that geodesic domes were used in the Arctic in creating shelters, and they were used by the military. You know, I followed Bucky's footsteps by designing a prefabricated bathroom for Habitat. He had done one in steel. This was in fiberglass. So the ideas were pursued, but it's only now, I think, 2 generations later, that we see the bigger ideas sort of being appreciated and taking root. I mean, for example, we talked today about electric cars. I don't know that Bucky ever talked about an electric car, but I know that had he been alive, he'd be one of the first ones to tell you how to make it and how to use it effectively. Maybe he'd been a step further and he would have a nuclear car or a hydrogen car or whatever. He was always like pushing the edge, thinking, what are the options?
But the most important and exciting architecture is Canada's own exhibit of housing called Habitat. It's on Mackay Pier, close to the city. There are 158 private houses of 1 to 4 bedrooms in this extraordinary complex. It looks like a Pueblo village in modern dress or a Mediterranean hill town without the hill. The 158 houses are made up of 354 interconnecting concrete boxes. Each box is 38.5 feet long, 17.5 feet wide, and 10 feet high.
But my subsequent intense encounter with Fuller was while I was doing Habitat at Expo. And here was a very fascinating situation. Bucky Fuller, who was the elder statesman, was designing the American Pavilion, the Great Dome, which was one of the marvels of Expo. He was coming in and out of town to implement the project. And down the street, I was in my little office, not so little by then, 40 people, working away on the drawings for Habitat. And while everything was approved and we were sailing forward, there were a lot of people nervous about Habitat, you know. I had not built a building before. I was not experienced by any measure. And so as we got approved and started working, one of the first visits was Bucky with some of the Expo management. They wanted him to look us over, to see what we were doing, to sort of get an elder statesman opinion. And he was totally supportive. And I remember so vividly that at some point, it was at our office in Place Ville-Marie in Montreal, he pulled out of his pocket a bracelet with charms hanging on it. And he said, "You're going to need all the luck in the world going forward." And he gave me the bracelet with the charms hanging on it, of which there is a photograph. And that symbolized very much my relationship with him going forward. I mean, he was always supportive, and he empowered you by his support. It wasn't just like it's nice to get support from someone of influence, but the fact that it was empowering. In designing Habitat and in designing the many habitats thereafter, fractal theory and fractal mathematics are fundamental to manipulating the envelope of a building to maximize outdoor spaces, terracing, surfaces, views, etc. But that's something that came after Bucky. This notion of being able to shop and be in a park and have attractions that are part of a natural environment, that mix is very appealing to Singaporeans, as it would be, I think, to any society. It evolved out of the design as we developed the shape of the toroid. We realized that we are able to drain the whole roof into the building. And it's a symbolic act, first of all, of collecting water in a country where water is precious. It's a practical thing that you collect that water and you can do things with it. But it's also a celebration of water, celebration of the rain, celebration of the elements, not to mention all the positive impacts it has on the climate of the building. It's interesting, the layers of his investigations and how they come back to sort of, I would say, make you smile. I remember when he came up with a proposal of this dome over Manhattan. And everybody chuckled. It seemed like a fantasy that's not very realizable. Yeah, I chuckled myself, I would say. And then who wants to live under an air-conditioned dome anyhow? And yet I would say my project Jewel in Changi Airport is very much a fulfillment of that idea, not at the scale of a whole city, but the scale of a great urban place that in Singapore, with its difficult climate and extreme heat and so on, you create a paradise by being able to do what he suggested. And doing so with a light touch, with a technology of construction that allows you to sort of hover over, as he had suggested. You know, influence and standing they fluctuate. I think certainly my generation is deeply indebted to him. I thought it was fascinating that Norman Foster, in pursuing the Apple store in Marina Bay Sands, talked about this is homage to Bucky and paying back a debt. And when I talked about Jewel a couple of years earlier in Singapore, I talked about Bucky and homage to Bucky, because the memories of the Montreal Dome hovering over Ile Ronde with its sail-like shading system has stayed with me ever since I walked into it 50 years ago. How to enclose space with such utter lightness, how to take a simple but complex shape of a sphere, which is so hard to divide, you know, and find a way to subdivide it so that you can construct it. You know, it's very easy to make a bubble. You make a soap bubble and it's perfect. But it's very difficult to make that same bubble with sticks. That's what he managed to do with a keen sense of mathematics and fabrication and geometry. Once you make a geodesic dome, it's not about the sticks, it's about what connects them. So the whole idea of a node, if you look at our project Jewel carefully, you see that all these pieces of steel that come together are received by a very precision-made, machined node. They just slip in the perfect way. It's all about the joint. And I think Bucky showed that any repetitive system, a space frame, a truss, anything that's made, a large structure made of little pieces, is all about being clever, inventive about the joint, the node. Well, I think first of all, our role as architects must be expanded to our role as urbanists. I mean, Bucky was a designer, thinker, urbanist, all of the above. And I think that must be true today, that when we talk about spaceship Earth, we must talk about cities, the form of cities, the mode of transportation, the way we heat and cool our buildings, the way we design them, the dependency we create in them for consuming energy to sustain themselves, to survive. I suppose Bucky's thinking could be extended to what you're wearing and what fabric it's made of and so on and so forth. But it just persists. It's a holistic view of how we create our environment and what its impact is on the planet. The very notion, planet Earth, is to recognize that we are sitting on a fragile organism, our planet, that we need to be conscious of. I think there was a kind of a school at the time, school of thought, that Bucky was part of, that Lou Kahn became part of, which is to look at nature and try and understand how nature designs and what we can learn from it. When I arrived in Philadelphia, I was introduced to the writings of Darcy Thompson, who is often called the father of morphology. Wonderful 2-volume book, still have it downstairs on my shelf, on growth and form. And in that book, Thompson outlines how organisms, natural organisms, but also some non-organic organisms, evolve in shape and form in response to natural selection, in one case, in living organisms, and in response to the laws of nature, crystallization, other forces of nature in the other. And particularly in his analysis of living creatures, he traces a causality that explains how a nautilus shell is that way with a spiral, logarithmic spiral, because it's the only way it could grow gnomotically so that its shape and size grow incrementally without having to discard the old shelter, so that it actually is the mathematical, logical outcome. Or he shows how the lattice structure of bones creates strength but reduces weight, which every structural engineer, of course, knows. And Bucky was part of that school that really impacted my obsession, I would call it, of designing something to achieve a fitness to purpose. How does one elaborate on fitness to purpose? It's like, it's a encompassing principle that there are reasons for designing things. There's a causality, which is a stronger word than reason, which is each move in design needs to respond to the life objective of what you're designing. In other words, it can be a house, it can be a shelter, it can be a school. Whatever that is, there are a series of forces that must be addressed. And as you address them, that helps to shape the building. As distinct from free-dealing, compositional, expressive designs, subjective outputs of the artist-architect. Well, I've been coming in and out of Singapore for decades. I think my first visit was in the mid-70s or late 70s. So it's a very dynamic, ever-changing, ever-developing city-state. And I recognize that to have achieved Jewel technologically, the gardens, and to have them continue to be maintained and impeccable, I could not do in many places, including some very advanced technological societies. I think that one of the things about Singapore is they do things thoroughly and then they maintain them thoroughly. It's part of the legacy. Jewel is about integrating nature in a way of plant life and what we associate with parks and the countryside into an urban structure, and having side by side the park and the marketplace. Side by side, but complementing each other, enriching each other. That's what Jewel is about. So to do that, you have to intervene with climate, you have to intervene with creating conditions for this to happen year-round. It would be relatively easy to do in Los Angeles, And it's much more difficult to do in Singapore, and it will be relatively difficult again to do it near the Arctic Circle. So climate extremes have enormous impact on architecture.